Good morning and welcome to our first set of notes for our Unit 2 Industrialization unit. So we're just going to go ahead and get started in talking about what is industrialization. So by the end of these notes, you need to be able to analyze how mechanized farming transformed our economy, so the machines, right? Identify new technologies that made the factory production more efficient, transforming then our economy, and then draw connections between industrialization and urbanization, and explain how industrialization increased immigration. So we're going to start by giving you a quick overview and then getting into the nitty-gritty of what you must understand. So the Industrial Revolution, just to give you some context, which is the setting, right, so that you have that understanding. It's a time of rapid industrial development, industry being that where you're manufacturing goods. This picture very much representing industry, right? Industrial development when inventions make producing goods easier and more profitable. As far as when it starts, the Industrial Revolution starts pretty closely after the end of the Civil War in 1865, but then it really picks up in the 1890s. And again, it's all over the United States as farmers move to cities. Okay, so more and more farmers moving to cities. So why? Well, farmers are moving to cities. That's really a big thing. Farmers are moving to cities to work in factories. But then again, why? So this is kind of the why of the Industrial Revolution, in that more people are moving into cities and therefore there's a bigger labor force. But why? Well, it's because of the Agricultural Revolution. And the Agricultural Revolution happened before the Industrial Revolution, right before it, where farming machinery and technologies made farming more efficient. So farming had to become more efficient before this whole industrial aspect and the production of goods could become more efficient. So just to further give you some context, we have to understand the Agricultural Revolution. So the first invention we're going to look at is the horse-drawn reaper. This was invented by Cyrus McCormick in 1831, and it makes harvesting 5 times faster. So you can see the kind of picture over here. It's horse-drawn, right? And there's the reaper there. So this invention made farming way more efficient. Okay, way more efficient, meaning that less farm hands were needed, forcing them to find work in the cities. So if he invented this in 1831, 9 years later, in 1840, he's selling it to other farms. And by the 1850s, he's the largest producer of farm equipment in the world. Another invention we're going to talk about is John Deere's riding plow. So this riding plow, as you can see in the picture here, it allowed for farmers to turn the heavy prairie sod, so starting their fields, much easier than with their iron and wooden plows. So again, it made farming much less physically demanding, requiring fewer people. So make sure you've made a note that both of these then made farming more efficient. So less farm hands were needed, forcing the people who were farm hands and working on farms to find work in the cities. So just to kind of sum this up, with the Agricultural Revolution, the biggest thing that you need to make a note of, the big impact that the Agricultural Revolution had, was that we, before this time, didn't have a ton of food, or at least it took a ton of work in order to get enough food. Now, with mechanized farming techniques and new technologies in the farming industry, there was plenty of food. So efficient farming allowed for greater food production, therefore giving a larger workforce to work in the factories in the cities. So as a result, we have something called urbanization. And again, this is one of those standards. You have to know how industrialization then impacted or influenced urbanization. So urbanization, by definition, is when people move from rural areas to those big cities, right? So the cities we know today were created and started in the Industrial Revolution because we saw such a mass flux of farmers going from those rural areas to cities. All right, so we've talked about the when and where, we've talked about the why. Let's talk about the how with the Industrial Revolution. So there are 3 factors of production that you need to make note of. First, over here we have the land, right? And land doesn't just mean like a land for farming, right? Like a big giant field, although yes, that's included. It's natural resources, including iron, oil, and steel. Those are really important. You also then have to have the labor aspect, the labor force, right? The hands, the bodies to do the work, and which we had. We had this labor force at the time because we had the land and resources, you could say, from the agricultural revolution that allowed for a sustainable amount of food production. And then finally, capital. And capital is money. And we're going to talk about the variety of people involved that provided that money and allowed for the Industrial Revolution. So these 3 things allow you to start a business, right? Which is the start of an industry. But this ability, these 3 things of production allowing you to start a business, coupled with laissez-faire economics, is what allowed our Industrial Revolution to really take off. Laissez-faire being the kind of hands-off approach of the government when it comes to the economy. So we've got to talk about the who of the Industrial Revolution. Again, there was a variety of people involved there, but mostly the ones that we're going to talk about are those rich company owners, known as the robber barons. And again, we're going to talk about the robber barons more specifically in the future. But these people were the ones providing that capital. But then we have all of the people doing the work, right? So we have the rich company owners who are providing the money, and then we have the immigrants and migrants. So immigrants being from abroad all over the world, migrants from all over the United States moving to cities and being the ones to do that work in the factories. We have to have both of those in order to have our revolution. So we've got to talk about the new inventions, the technological inventions that changed American life during the Industrial Revolution. And the first inventions that we're going to talk about are ones that changed the way that we work. Okay, so working used to be much slower, as we've kind of discussed already in a few areas. So what were those inventions that allowed us to become quicker? Well, the first one is the mechanized assembly line, and that's where each person on the assembly line is doing the same, often smaller, repetitive task over and over and over again. So make sure you have that definition down. And the impact being that it increased production, right? Production went through the roof, causing lower prices. So that means raised wages for those workers and lowered hours of the employees. So yeah, the prices being reduced obviously for consumers because goods were so easy to make because of the assembly line. The next one is the incandescent light bulb. This one being kind of obvious, like, hello, electricity. It increased production in factories. Why? Well, because they were able to work at night. People were able to work that 3rd shift. So factories were then able to be open around the clock, producing goods, further driving down those prices, raising wages, and those sorts of things. But what else? It's not just the light bulb, it's electricity. So the fact that we had electricity in factories and homes and areas for lights, that means we had electricity for other things, including many of the appliances and other inventions that came at the time. For instance, the washing machine was invented around this time. Another invention changing our work is the telephone. Obviously improving communication, right? So we're able to, that's further increasing production and communication there. The next kind of category of inventions that we're going to talk about is new technology in transportation. And the biggest one that we need to talk about, having by far the most impact, is the Transcontinental Railroad. So in the 1800s, the Transcontinental Railroad connected the West Coast, so if we're looking at this map down here in California, the West Coast to the Midwest here in Iowa. And then there was kind of a network of railways that then connected the Midwest here in Iowa to all the way over to the East Coast. So our entire country was connected through this rail network, having such a huge impact on the industry. So it increased markets, jobs, and it really stimulates the economy because goods are able to be transported, people are able to be transported to go work in different areas. We had 2,000 miles of railroad because of the Transcontinental Railroad. That's just, it changes the world, it changes our country. So it makes travel more reliable and widely utilized, right? And then expands settlement to the west, and that we have everyday Americans, more of them, lots more of them, all over the country. We also had at the time the invention of the automobile and the airplane, which you have read about in your guided readings. Okay, so our last topic that we're going to talk about in this first set of notes is immigration. So we see an influx. We see an influx in immigration at this time, like a really huge one. But we've got to talk about the who and the why. So first, let's talk about the why really quickly. So with all of this industrialization, we had many, many job opportunities, many jobs to offer. So people start coming from all over the world. And you can see on the map here that people from China and Asia are coming to the west coast of the United States, and people from all over Europe are coming to the east coast. And that being our who, right? So in Europe, people are traveling to our east coast, and from Asia, people are traveling to our west coast. And as more people come into the country, it's creating more competition for jobs, which then drives down wages. But then we're also going to talk about the other social effects that it had because of that increased job competition. So the push and pull factors, and I need you to list at least two of each of these. And this is, again, the why. Why are people coming to the United States? Well, there's push factors, ones that push people from their country to flee, and then there's pull factors. So factors in the United States drawing people to come here. So the pull factors, again, pull people into a country are things like job opportunities, stability, freedom that our democracy offers, and that safety aspect as well. And then the push factors from their countries that we saw at the time were immense poverty, fear and persecution, natural disasters, any kind of disasters, and that unemployment and not finding a job. So the immigration centers that we see at the time include Ellis Island in New York, where thousands upon thousands upon thousands of immigrants were coming through this immigration center during this time. And then we also have Angel Island in San Francisco on our west coast. So you may have heard of this term called the melting pot, which oftentimes is what America is called. So we're going to kind of use that to frame our minds around what America looked like at this time, what our culture looked like, what our people were, where they were living. So a melting pot is where all cultures come together. So they're melting into one American culture, which is what we call America. But what it actually looked like, and you could argue still looks like to an extent today, is where all cultures retain some aspect of their mother country. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but what we see, for instance, is that like Italians at the time live among each other, right? So they live in the same neighborhoods, reading Italian newspapers, speaking Italian for most of their day, retaining their culture. And that it's a little Italian city in the United States. And most cities you will find come to look like this at this time, and that there's those centers of where people came from still living together. So kind of building off of this topic of immigration, we have to talk about nativism. Nativism is the anti-immigrant, anti-foreign sentiment, which is a feeling. And we have surges in reaction. Nativism surges in reaction to large numbers of, remember the two groups of immigrants we had at the time coming from Europe and Asia. So again, it's this resistance to immigration, a racist backlash against immigrants, mostly Irish and Chinese. Because we have this influx of workers at the time due to immigration, it makes for more competition. Because there's so many people to work, it drives wages down. So even further fueling that anger and animosity there. And even later on in the 1900s, so this is around in the mid-1890s, later in the early 1900s, there were even quotas put in place to keep immigrants from coming here as a response to this backlash. And you've probably heard, even today, but it was kind of a sounding board back then, is that immigrants, are taking our native United States Americans, right? They're taking our jobs. And you see this a lot of times. So like the KKK membership, for instance, this is a rally against immigrants and African Americans. You see membership of groups like the KKK swell during this time. So again, a huge racist backlash against immigration. So lastly, let's talk about living conditions. Because there were so many people in cities, specifically young immigrant families, cities became very overcrowded. So the living conditions became very poor. And we saw a kind of explosion of things called tenement buildings. And these tenements were windowless, oftentimes windowless, and that sure, they had like one window here, but oftentimes even in the middle of the building or in the basement, there were no windows. They were overcrowded, and as you can see in this picture, you've got multiple adults and children living in one-room apartments. And look, there's one window on their door. It's just, the living conditions are very poor. So at this time, you want to stop and answer the summary questions on your notes and get a stamp from your teacher when you are finished. Everybody have a great day.